Welcome to the final installment of PMTV's AP US History Review. Today we'll be reviewing the period from 1898 to 1945, period 7 according to APUSH, and we'll be doing some review of DBQ strategies with the exam coming up later this week. There are a couple DBQs from this period that are on the landing page for today's final class of APUSH, PMTV. There's also the full terms list that will cover not only APUSH, but in case you're taking it, the SAT subject test in US history. That terms list does include 1945 to the present, and more material before 1607 that is not on this year's APUSH exam, but will still be on upcoming subject tests. So again, as you think about preparing for Friday's APUSH exam, or if you happen to be taking the early June makeup date, remember that only periods 3 through 7 will be the basis of a DBQ this year. You're welcome to bring in material from periods 1 and 2, but you're not required to, and they won't be the focus of an essay question. All right, with that in mind, we'll do a content review. My goal here is to go for about 30, max 35 minutes if at all possible. It's not like much happens between 1898 and 1945, so I'm sure it'll go just smoothly. But I want to leave time for talking about a couple of DBQs and just sort of going back over the rubric, going back over like what they expect students to do. So I'm going to start with the Progressive Era. As you remember, last week we talked about the labor movement and the populist movement as grassroots up responses to a changing America. By and large, the progressive movement is a top-down movement. It's one of the great topics in US history for sort of looking at how people wildly disagree about its meaning. For some, the progressive era is a period of really expanding democracy, creating a much more active government to respond to the needs of those who are left behind during the Gilded Age. For others, the progressive era reinforces hierarchies, especially racial and class hierarchies, really sort of celebrates expertise in a way that was unprecedented in American history and sort of has been something that Americans have argued about, have wrestled with ever since, is sort of the role of experts in our society. And there's cases to be made that it really was, in fact, a period that expanded democratic participation and created a responsive government, and that it was also far less democratic and reinforced hierarchies. There's real validity on both points. And so when you're thinking about writing a complex essay, that's a good example of sort of how you think about when, for that DBQ point about complexity, it's kind of both. And acknowledging that it's not just one or the other. This is not your SAT essay where you make, or your ACT essay where you make a claim. This is where you need to deal with complexity, because it's going to get just more complex from here moving forward into college history courses. Progressivism, comes from a few different sources. It includes the federal government. Both Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, Roosevelt a Republican, Wilson a Democrat, were very much identified with the progressive era and with the goals, with the policy positions of this time period. We see a bunch of constitutional amendments, the 16th through the 19th, that really represent various aspects of progressivism. Granting the women to vote with the 19th Amendment, prohibition, the 18th Amendment, direct election of senators, 16th, and implementing a federal income tax with the 17th. I may have those two flipped up. But the basic point about sort of changing how the government gets revenue, providing for the people, not just state legislatures to elect senators, granting women the right to vote, and prohibition, which may not seem particularly open-minded from our point of view, but represented the moral reform angle of progressivism, all represented major progressive policy planks. You see the commitment by both Roosevelt and Wilson to trust busting, to taking a fair, being fair about negotiating strikes, not just sort of immediately putting the federal government in on the side of the owners, as we talked about last time with the Gilded Age. This time, for example, Roosevelt with the anthracite coal strike gets management and owners to negotiate with striking workers, promising a square deal for all. And that foreshadows his cousin Franklin's later presidency with the New Deal. You see all sorts of new legislation like the Pure Food and Drug Act, the Meat Inspection Act, and some of these policies were responses to muckrakers, the investigative reporters, photographers, and other people working to expose the crimes and the abuses of Gilded Age society. You probably have heard of, you might even have read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, a novel about immigrant workers in Chicago in the meatpacking industry. Upton Sinclair, himself a socialist, argued that he had hoped to sort of foment support for socialist policies and somewhat regretted, as he put it, he aimed for his readers' heads and hit their stomachs, because his tales of how disgusting it was to be in the meatpacking factories really helped get legislation passed ensuring the safety of the food supply. You have Theodore Roosevelt supporting the creation of the US Forest Service, which is about expert management of forest, basically of the woods of the country, as well as creating a national park system. And the test does like the debate between conservationists, such as the Forest Service and Gifford Pinchot, and preservationists, such as John Muir and of the Sierra Club, and creating a national park system. Basically, conservationists are about managing resources efficiently through expert knowledge. Preservationists are about preserving the landscape for all to enjoy for posterity. Roosevelt was sympathetic with both positions and got himself involved in some of the battles between the preservationists and the conservationists, helping each along the way. You see along the way, through the Progressive Era, new child labor laws. You see expansion of antitrust laws, new workplace safety laws, especially in response to the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire in New York City that killed almost 150 workers, mostly young women and girls who were mostly immigrants, Italian and Jewish, who were trapped in a building where all the exit doors were locked as a fire tore through this building. You see state level reforms, introducing recalls, initiatives, and referenda, basically all about giving individual voters more say in public policy making. And you probably associate this period with people like Jane Addams from the settlement movement, Margaret Sanger from birth control, really the first major activist to fight for the rights to contraception, for access to contraception. Again, the temperance movement, most notably the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and the movement for women's voting rights. So these all represent various aspects of progressivism. I'm condensing something that I usually give 2 lectures to at least in a full class, into about 7 or 8 minutes. So if it seems rushed, there's a reason for that. But you get the general idea. All right, I'm going to switch for a bit now to foreign policy, and especially starting with the War of 1898 and then going into World War I. You will remember that this is, at the end of the 19th century, the frontier was basically gone. We talked about Frederick Jackson Turner and his frontier thesis. We've talked about manifest destiny. There's still an urge to keep expanding. And this is also happening at the same time as European powers are racing to colonize large parts of the globe, especially in Africa. And so many American political leaders really see that the United States has a role to play on the world stage. There wasn't the desire to sort of join the race for Africa, but there was a desire to make its presence felt around the world and in new ways. 1867, the US buys Alaska. In the 1880s and 1890s, the United States' presence in Hawaii, then an independent kingdom, increases until the point when US corporate interests basically engineer a crisis, and the United States ends up annexing Hawaii in 1898. But the War of 1898 is sort of the US debut on the global stage. It's the first time the United States engages militarily a foreign power, a European power, Spain. Americans had long been interested in Cuba, and as Cubans fought for independence from Spain in the last major Spanish colony in the New World, support for the Cuban cause grew and grew and grew in the United States, especially whipped up by what was called yellow journalism, the newspapers of William Hearst, Joseph Pulitzer, called yellow journalism for literally the kind of paper the papers were printed on. And when there's a mysterious explosion in Havana Harbor that destroys the USS Maine, a brand new battleship, the assumption is that Spain had attacked the American battleship. Decades and decades later, it became increasingly clear that it was almost certainly an accident, but at the time it looked like a deliberate attack. And the United States goes to war with Spain. And over the course of about 4 months, defeats Spain, drives the Spanish out of the New World. The United States gains Puerto Rico as a colony, Guam as a colony, as a territory. The United States establishes a temporary protectorate over Cuba before granting it independence, and it purchases the Philippines for about $20 million. The purchase of the Philippines has sort of gained more and more attention over time, but it really was controversial at the time because everything else in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico and Cuba were pretty close to the United States, if not physically adjacent. Guam was too small to be of major debate, but the Philippines, were a very large territory, with millions of residents, who were not of, who were Filipino, and was the question of how would they become American? Would they not become American? Debates over, what was the responsibility of the United States to the Philippines. In the long run, the United States grants independence in 1946, but in the short term, there's a guerrilla war that the United States fights with Filipinos who want their independence that claims at least 5,000 American lives and tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Filipino lives. The numbers are all over the place. But it is both the first major projection of American power into the Pacific, setting up much of the 20th century, and it's also a foreshadowing of conflicts to come, ranging from the Pacific War during World War II to the insurgency wars in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. You can read about the continuing sort of foreign policy developments at this time, like the Panama Canal, the US promotion of the open door in China, Roosevelt corollary, which basically builds on the Monroe Doctrine and gives the United States effectively carte blanche to act in Latin America, or the United States claims it anyway. And so there are many, many US interventions throughout Latin America through the 1910s and 1920s, invading Nicaragua, Honduras, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and elsewhere. World War I, though, is sort of greater, more likely to come up on an AP exam. Now, keep in mind that the wars, World War I, World War II, the Civil War, whatever else, by and large, they're not going to be interested in the battles, the sort of, the American Expeditionary Force in World War I, the details of fighting World War II. They're going to be interested in how the home front changes, how these wars change the US role in the world, how they change society at home. Those are the kinds of things that are likely to be asked by a question, an APUSH question. And even the subject test, by and large, is more interested in those trends too. With World War I, the key things to remember are that for the first 3 years of the huge European conflict, the United States more or less tried to stay neutral. Woodrow Wilson talked a lot about the neutrality of the United States and keeping the seas open. As the Germans engaged in more and more submarine warfare, the United States grew closer to the Allies, despite the fact that originally there was a lot of desire to keep the country out of the war, in part because there's a huge number of German American immigrants who were sympathetic to Germany. But over time, US public opinion drifted. And then after the attack on the sinking of the Lusitania, in which more than 1,000 people were killed, and 128 of whom were Americans, the United States went to war. US forces helped break the stalemate of the long European war, and by late 1918, the Germans and the other Central Powers surrendered. Things that are likely to come up here are the peace conference at Versailles, and how Wilson, on one hand, represented idealism, especially in the face of both opposition at home and vindictive British and French negotiators, and on the other hand, his racism, which shaped his view of everything from sort of civil rights and Jim Crow at home to the fact that his promotion of self-determination for European powers did not, for European nations like Yugoslavia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and so on, did not extend to the colonies ruled by European powers made up of Asians, Africans, and other people of color around the global South. You can read about the 14 points. You can read about the failure of the League of Nations, the establishment of the League of Nations, but how the United States Senate defeated the treaty and sort of ushering in a new age of American isolationism. The 1920s are, for me, one of the more just fascinating moments, more fascinating eras in American history. The 20s really, in many ways, represent a battle between modernization and backlash. And frankly, the world of the 1990s, the 2000s, the 2010s, in many ways resemble the 20s. The 20s look more familiar in this particular way, that you could have some tremendous social change, cultural change, and also some tremendous backlash. In the 20s version of that, you have the Jazz Age. You have the images of flappers that you've no doubt seen. You've got, and the flappers really represent a change in gender roles. The images of women stepping out in public in the 1900s and 1910s, are progressive reformers, are the suffrage advocates, are the temperance advocates, very serious, usually elite women. In the 20s, there's much more of an image after the exhaustion with the war of women going out to have a good time. And you can imagine the flapper dresses that represent this. This is also the period of the Model T and Henry Ford's assembly line car production. And it's really the beginning of an automotive society as we know it, and even tourism as we know it. But cars give Americans, in many ways, especially young Americans, freedom to just move around without the supervision of adults or other elders that they always had to work around before. And so having automobiles more and more easily accessible creates a much more mobile society, locally as well as around the nation. You're sort of moving around the nation. This is really at the time of an emerging national media culture. You have NBC and CBS emerge as radio networks, and for the first time, Americans are listening to the same programming all over the place. They're getting more and more of the same news. They're seeing the same advertisements. This is really a golden age for advertising. They're shopping for the same goods at chain stores. They're beginning to watch the new pro National Football League and follow the same first Hollywood stars and watch the same movies. So this is just the tip of the iceberg of really an emerging national media culture and consumer culture and even entertainment culture. Something that is easily, something we can really wrap our minds around from, all of the, celebrity stars of today. I also mentioned how this is a period of backlash, and it is a period of, after World War I, some of the worst race riots and largest strikes in American history, and the first Red Scare, in which, just the fear of, anarchists, socialists, and communists was, quite intense. And it was a fear that was associated with certain ethnic groups. We can imagine the post 9/11 association of terrorism with certain ethnic and religious groups today, in recent history. Here, the association of violence and of strikes and of disorder is with immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, Italians, Jews, Russians, Finns, Greeks, and so on. And that's one of several forces that leads to immigration restriction. In 1924, the most restrictive immigration act in American history is passed. Basically cuts off all immigration from Asia, other than the Philippines, which is, as mentioned, a US colony. It substantially, radically reduces the immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and sets up a quota system based on 1890 figures, so to really privilege immigration coming from Northern and Western Europe. This is the period of the Scopes trial, which you may have heard of, where a teacher in Tennessee is arrested and jailed for teaching evolution. And it's the period of the second Ku Klux Klan. The Klan is larger than ever. Its rise is based, sort of builds upon the first motion picture, Birth of a Nation, which is is a visual history of the Klan. It's really remarkable early work of filmmaking. It's one of the very, very first films, period. And Woodrow Wilson, as I noted, with his racial politics, promoted the film, sort of described it as history written with white lightning. The Klan of the 10s and 20s has hundreds of thousands of members, if not even millions. It's not only anti-African-American, which is how we primarily think of the Klan, but it's anti-immigrant, it's anti-Catholic, it's anti-Jewish, it's anti-immigrant. It's against the chain stores and changing gender roles of the 20s as well. And the Klan is really a national force at this point, not just a regional force. It elects politicians from Portland, Maine to Portland, Oregon. It elects governors, senators, congressmen, mayors. It really has, for a few years, a major force in American politics. But with the various scandals, it begins to recede in power and returns to being a much more marginal and organization focused on anti-Black hatred. I know I'm going at breakneck speed here, so thanks for your patience. And this will be again available on YouTube if you need to review it and need to catch up on something that you might have missed. Let me go through the Great Depression and then the New Deal. The presidents of, the three presidents between Wilson and Roosevelt are all Republicans: Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. This is sort of they're a bit of a throwback to the Gilded Age, where their belief was the idea of a government that does the least is the best. Harding is mostly remembered, even though he was an honest man himself, pretty much everyone around him was involved in all sorts of scandals, and the Teapot Dome comes up. It's unlikely to be an APUSH question, but the subject test loves the Teapot Dome. There's a lot of great cartoons about it, so keep an eye out for those. Really, the only thing you need to know about Harding is the Teapot Dome scandal, and that he promoted a return to normalcy. And that did mean the idea of, sort of being, Americans were tired of all the reforms, sort of all the agitation of the 10s and the OOs and the 10s, of the war in particular. And so that's what, Harding was talking about when he, created the word normalcy in misspeaking, but it's stuck in our language. The economy booms during this period, but it's a very hollow boom. This is a period of all sorts of over-speculation, overextension of credits. It's not yet the credit card economy, but it's, people are buying cars and furniture on installment plans. There's a vast disparity of wealth. There's tremendous poverty in sections of the country, especially rural America, which has some of the worst droughts and floods in American history. I know I talked about that last week with the 1870s and 1880s. This would be the other period that sort of is really notable for its floods and droughts, leading to the Dust Bowl. And if you've read the Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, you've seen a story of the Dust Bowl that has stuck with us to today. All of the economic, and again, these are presidents who want to do very little in terms of regulating the economy. And so all of that leads to a booming economy that then crashes pretty suddenly in October 1929. Just before the crash of October 29, unemployment was 3.2%. It soars to 24.9%. Just to give you some comparison points, about 2-3 months ago, the unemployment rate in the United States was 3.5%, so pretty similar. It's now officially just under 15%, and there are estimates that it could be closer to 20%, depending on how we count gig workers and others who are not traditionally counted in surveys of the workforce. So the crisis we're facing right now is the worst, is the biggest shock to the economy since the Great Depression and since the crash of 29. What the long-term implications will be something that future historians will get to tell us. Herbert Hoover is interesting insofar as he is a success in every single thing he does in his life except be president. He was in the cabinet during, he was a key figure in Wilson's planning for the war. He helped a lot of the European relief efforts. He was Secretary of the Treasury earlier in the 20s, and he becomes president early in 1929. And he really tries to he refuses to get the government, to make the government do things to relieve the crisis. And he sort of relies on the generosity of big business to try and make things right, which goes exactly nowhere. Unsurprisingly, this leads to Franklin Roosevelt's overwhelming victory in 1932. And the 1932 election is notable for being the margin of Roosevelt's election. Obviously, we think about him in the New Deal, and I'll say more about that in a second. It's also a fundamentally realigning election in American history. It's one that, up until this point, African Americans had voted 95% or more, with the Republican Party being the party of Lincoln, being the party that was more closely related to civil rights. This shifts, and it shifts, to the state permanently, where those numbers swing overwhelmingly to the Democratic Party as Roosevelt makes for what at that point was the most firm commitment to civil rights by an American president. So Franklin Roosevelt enters office in March 1933. We talked about the New Deal. There's a whole alphabet soup of laws and policies. I'll note a few here, but let me distinguish the first and second New Deal. The first New Deal really is what he does in his first 100 days, his first year and a half as president. It's about relief and it's about recovery. And it's about, more than anything, restoring Americans' confidence in the government and in society. Roosevelt was not an ideologue. He would experiment with, if this works, great. If it doesn't work, we'll toss that and we'll try something else. He was steering the United States between the extremes of conservative critics, some in his own party, this was white Southern Democrats, and some in the Republican Party who accused him of being a communist. At the same time, he's also president while you have a growing socialist movement, a growing communist movement, a growing labor movement in the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO that later merges with the AFL. And he's trying, like leaders in Britain, France, and Canada, he's trying to steer the United States in between rising fascism in Europe and the success and popularity of Stalin's Soviet Union, which at this time is being seen for its tremendous economic growth rather than its human rights record and its sort of gross crimes against humanity. At this point, those are not so well known. There are people who oppose, there are many people who oppose the Soviet Union on principle, but since the Soviet Union is the only country to escape the Great Depression because it pulled itself outside of the economy, to some it looks like a very tempting model of change. So Roosevelt is trying to steer the course forward through these extremes. In his first 100 days, he passes banking laws, the federal FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, so that if you put money in the bank, it's going to be there when you come for it. We take that for granted. Turned out during the great crash of 3029, you couldn't take that for granted at that point. He creates the Civilian Conservation Corps to put young men, overwhelmingly, out to work in a whole range of physical projects and natural resource projects. He launches the Tennessee Valley Authority to bring electric power to large parts of rural Tennessee and the greater Tennessee River Valley. The National Recovery Act that regulates hours, regulates wages and prices, a number of other actions. Through these years, as I noted, he's got his critics. Huey Long proposes a Share Our Wealth program. Francis Townsend, who proposes this wild idea of that older Americans should get a monthly check from the government. Father Coughlin, a sort of right-wing populist, using radio to sort of spread his message, calls for nationalizing the banks. And Roosevelt, in part, decides that he needs to be more ambitious to shore up his support. And so this leads to things like the Social Security Act. This leads to the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, that builds highways, parks, bridges, libraries, other recreational facilities. I'll have to double check to see if the GW Parkway was one of them. It certainly is the kind of parkway, and it's the right era. I haven't actually confirmed that it was actually a WPA project, but exactly the kind of project the WPA did tons of around the cities of the country. The Wagner Act, which guaranteed the right for labor unions to bargain collectively, and it sort of was the biggest legal victory for the labor movement to that point in American history. Critics have, with good reason, called the New Deal a halfway revolution. There were all sorts of forces that constrained Roosevelt's ability to do more than he did. And he certainly at times got ambitious with his scheme to pack the Supreme Court. There is some relief. The US is in a better position by 1936, by 1939, even with some economic dips along the way in there, than it was at the beginning of his administration. But it's only World War II that really brings the United States out of depression. But what Roosevelt does is, he sort of really speeds up the dynamic that's underway from the progressive era forward, which is fundamentally expanding the power of the American federal government with all of these New Deal programs. And in fact, World War II and then the Cold War further intensified this dynamic. In fact, really accelerated even more that the process of mobilizing to fight World War II and then to fight the Cold War, and really in many ways organizing society around both of those efforts, represents a watershed in just how powerful the federal government is in a way that would be almost unrecognizable by early American political leaders. All right, I'll finish with World War II, and specifically about how the war, sort of thinking about how this course, sort of strangely cut off in 1945, but to sort of wrap up, what you need to know for this particular year's test, thinking about how the US heads towards World War II, not even remotely thinking about going to war. As I alluded to before, the isolationism that's born by really the bitterness with the World War I experience intensifies through the 20s and 30s. Europe looks more and more like a place to just have nothing to do with, especially as fascists come to power in Germany and Italy, as the Depression, is even worse in some ways in Europe. Again, the rise of Stalinism. Congress passes a series of 3 neutrality acts in the mid-30s that really aim to keep the United States out of any future European conflicts, which by this point people can imagine are on the way. There are isolationist organizations, one of the most, and some organizations that were openly or subtly pro-Nazi, the America First Committee, most notably. Many of the critiques of Roosevelt were framed in anti-Semitic language, and again, sometimes subtly pro-Hitler, sometimes not so subtly. Pioneering pilot Charles Lindbergh was one of the most well-known representatives of the America First Committee. But war is brewing in both the Pacific and Europe. In the Pacific, Japan invades Manchuria, northern China in 1931, and then sort of invades the heart of China in 1937. So the Pacific War is well underway, long before the Germans invade Poland. Hitler is on the march with, incorporating Austria into the German Reich with the Anschluss, then annexing the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, and eventually signing a non-aggression pact with Stalin in the summer of 1939, which divides up Eastern Europe between Stalin and Hitler and clears the way for Germany to, in fact, invade Poland. When that invasion does take place on September 1st, 1939, Britain and France declare war. The United States, for the moment being, looks to stay out. Roosevelt sees where this is going, also recognizes that public opinion is still fundamentally against war, but really steers the United States towards a firm support for the Allies. This includes the Lend-Lease Act, which provides all sorts of material aid to the United Kingdom and eventually to the Soviet Union after Germany has overrun continental Western Europe. Has invades and occupies France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, and more. In 1939 and 1941, you have an escalating undeclared naval war between the United States and Germany in the Atlantic Ocean. And in the Pacific, after the Japanese invade the French colonies that France can't defend in Vietnam, what's now Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, the United States gives Japan an ultimatum to withdraw. Japan decides that rather than comply, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor and attacks various other US and British outposts across the Western Pacific. And here we have World War II. The US declares war on Japan, Germany and Italy declare war on the United States. Here we go. You're not going to have to get into all the details of the war, but being aware that this is a two-front war, and very different kinds of war in Europe and the Pacific. You're more likely to have questions come up about the home front, about the massive mobilization to create all the weapons needed for war, the conversion of the civilian economy into a wartime economy, and then how that actually shapes the post-war economy. Again, you're not going to have to do much with the post-war, but just really it sets up the incredible affluence of post-war America. Knowing about, say, Rosie the Riveter and American women going, more than 1 million American women serving in the armed forces during World War II, and many, many more women working in the industrial workforce than ever before. Knowing about the internment of Japanese Americans and the relocation of thousands upon thousands of Japanese to about a dozen camps, mostly across the Mountain West, a few in the South. Knowing about how African-American, the double V campaign for African-Americans, sort of campaign to defeat fascism abroad and racism at home, that in many ways helped spur the modern stage of the civil rights movement. And how Roosevelt, though, took some of the first steps for the federal government to ban discrimination, at least in federal contracting during the wartime. So that's probably, again, covered 1898 to 1940 in about 35 minutes. I know it's rushed, but again, this will be up on YouTube and hopefully as soon as possible. I know you've got the test coming up on Friday. But I do want to spend the rest of our time now talking about the DBQ, since you're going to have one DBQ on Friday, and to sort of just go over the rubric. And then I've got in this PowerPoint today 2 examples, both from this period. Honestly, last year's DBQ was on progressivism. The sample they've given you, if you looked at the website in the last week or 2 that I've got on this PowerPoint, is from 1914 to 1945. I can't promise you. I think the chances that they'd have 2 progressive or post-progressive era DBQs in a row is low, but I can't tell you that definitively. So I wouldn't, so if I could, we could have skipped this whole lecture. Realistically though, I think it's more likely you're gonna get a 19th century topic or or something that even covers the, American Revolution and early 19th century. But it's still possible. So we'll use the DBQ, 2 sample DBQs, including the one they just put up, to sort of talk about this. But again, the key points, they've tinkered with the DBQ with an eye towards the fact that it's only 1 question this year for the AP. And I know I said some of this in the first session, but it can't hurt to go over it, and it can't hurt to go over it with the documents in front of us. And by the way, the 2 DBQs are also posted to the landing page for today's class for APUSH. So this essays will be graded on 10 points. Thesis, most students have no trouble with making an argument, something that is historically defensible. World War II started for the United States in December 1941 is a fact. Arguing about how World War II changed the roles for women, for African Americans in society, there are arguments there. So that's something that somebody that you can support with evidence, and that someone else can reasonably sort of offer a different interpretation. Most of my students don't have a problem coming up with a thesis and getting the thesis point. Contextualization, what's going on? So for example, I talked about, we looked a couple weeks ago at the anti-slavery DBQ and thinking about how does the market revolution and the demand for cotton shape the politics of slavery in antebellum America. So it's not enough. I think the big thing here, students often have an idea about context. The big thing to make sure to get your point is that you're not just dropping in the reference, but that you're really engaging how does the context shape what you're talking about. So that example, how does the market revolution shape politics of slavery? How does manifest destiny and the acquisition of territory after the Mexican-American War shape the politics of slavery and the road to the Civil War? Again, students usually do well with that, but I really just making sure it's more than just dropping in. Evidence. Okay, so here are literally half of the points on this year's test. Using 2 documents to respond to a prompt. And that's pretty much a gimme, the first one. The next 2, using at least 2 that you're actually not just dropping them in, but you're really engaging the evidence and sort of connecting the evidence to your argument you're making. That's a point. If you use 4 out of the 5, that's another point. So those first 3 points should be easy to get. Again, don't just repeat them, but sort of synthesize them. It can help to put, and honestly, don't spend a ton of time quoting directly. Rephrase, put it in your own words. You want to do so correctly, but sort of making sure you're making the documents your own. You do want to do so in a specific way, though, so it's not just so-and-so opposes slavery or so-and-so opposes annexing the Philippines, but sort of getting at the substance. The last 2 points about evidence beyond documents. Again, I know I'm repeating myself here, but it's again about connecting the evidence you bring in. So not just mentioning, but really building them into your argument. And I've gone through this with a bunch of students I'm working with for APUSH and AP World, where I think the big challenge is often, especially when you're writing under stress, especially when it's all the pressure of an exam, it's like, have I actually made my point? Because it's so easy to just be like, oh, I said it. And then you go back and like, ooh, I didn't integrate it as well as I thought I did. So being aware of that as you're working. And finally, the last 3 points, are about explaining the document's point of view, who the author is, who the audience is, and you don't have to do all of them, just doing at least one of them for each of 2 documents to get both points. Again, no, I'm sounding like a broken record, but doing so in a way that engages the argument, not just identifying, but sort of synthesizing. And finally, the complexity point. Complexity is sort of the one I think a lot of students struggle with. Let's go back to what I said at the beginning of this class, both today's class and the whole PMTV class, talking about, was the American Revolution radical or was it conservative? Was the progressive era something that was sort of expanded democratic participation and made the federal government more responsive, or did it primarily reinforce hierarchies? An argument that tackles both parts of that, acknowledges both parts of that, is engaging in complexity. I get a lot of students who think, oh, it's like, oh, didn't I get this point for things A, B, and C caused the Civil War? Things A, B, and C led to the Industrial Revolution. There's a decent chance you might not get the credit for that. I know it looks promising. It's not out of the possibility. And certainly, the way you read frankly, if you read the rubric from the College Board, it's not entirely clear. That isn't enough. But trust me, that may not be enough. So think about sort of how does your argument work for this group, but not for that group. Here we see similarity. Here we see difference. Here we see connections over time. Drawing connections, the rise of print literacy and the politics of, print, for, say, William Lloyd Garrison and the Liberator for anti-slavery politics, with Yale journalism in the Progressive era, where the role of, the radio, progressive politics, progressive era politics, and then, using the radio for political purposes in the 20s and 30s. Sort of, again, continuity and change, that both things are happening. All right, gone over the rubric. Let's look at, I don't know if we'll get through 2 DBQs. I've got them here. These are both samples. Evaluate the extent to which differing ideas of national identity shape views of American overseas expansion in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So this gets at the idea of, I was talking about earlier today about American expansion overseas, sort of after the frontier closes, and certainly you'd want to mention the frontier as evidence-based document, evidence beyond the documents, and we're tied into these ideas about national identity. Here, document 1, we have the editor of an African-American newspaper here in DC talking about the idea that Black participation in the war will eventually help with, tear down racial prejudice, effectively making it a case that, tying Black participation in the war to what's changing, 1898 is really the consolidation of Jim Crow across the South. Really the process of disenfranchising African Americans is now complete. And there's ways that, reading this, I think I see Cooper's argument, and I see a comparison, I see a continuity with Booker T. Washington arguing that African American economic activity will lead to equality, will lead to an end or withering of prejudice. Our second document is from William Graham Sumner, a prominent sociologist at Yale, actually the first sociology professor in the US. Americans have been committed from the outset to the doctrine that all men are equal. It is astonishing extent that we have lived to see American arms carry this domestic dogma out where it must be tested in its application to uncivilized and half-civilized people. At the first touch of the test, we throw the doctrine away and adopt the Spanish doctrine. We are told by all the imperialists that these people are not fit for liberty and self-government, that it is rebellion for them to resist our beneficence. We must send fleets and armies to kill them if they do it, that they must devise a government for them and administer it ourselves, and so on. I mean, basically, this is a speech that is, on one hand, reinforces the racial ideologies of the day, reinforces the sense of, the hierarchies of scientific racism, but also, and sort of the idea that the peoples of the Philippines, are not, are fundamentally different than Americans. At the same time, this is also highly critical of the logic of imperialists, and sort of effectively saying we are throwing away, our notions of who we are as Americans in our commitment to democracy by extending imperial rule over the Philippines. This, on the other hand, is President William McKinley talking to a church, talk about audience, about his decision to acquire the Philippines. When I next realized the Philippines had dropped into our laps, the United States had defeated Spain and bought the Philippines for 20 years. So it's not exactly dropping into our laps. Ask Democrats, I ask Republicans for advice. I'm not sure what to do, and so I pray. And we have here, something that sort of is justifying American rule over the Philippines. There was nothing left for us to do but take them all and educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace to do the very best we could. Now let me also remember, they were a Spanish colony. There's a very large Catholic population. So the idea of Christianizing a large Catholic population is something to be aware of in reading this document. And that's probably a more advanced reading here. But nonetheless, sort of this idea of the role of Americans spreading Christianity, the secular government of the United States promoting this religious mission is worth noting. Here we have Jane Addams. Now, we mostly think about Addams in terms of her settlement work with immigrants and Hull House in Chicago. But she also won the Nobel Peace Prize for her work against war. And the subjectess has often quoted Addams and some of her speeches connecting what goes on in Chicago, what goes on in American cities to American foreign policy, or for that matter, to voting rights and to women's suffrage. Then came the Spanish War with its guilt and its lace and tinsel. And again, the moral issues are confused with the exhibitions of brutality. For 10 years, I have lived in a neighborhood which is by no means criminal. She goes on to talk about all the murders in her nearby neighborhood in Chicago. And goes on to talk about the little children on the street played at war, killing Spaniards. The humane instinct gives way and the barbaric instinct asserts itself. So here, she's really tackling the kind of enthusiasm for war, the militarism. One of the words of the day was jingoism. Don't know if you came across this in your textbooks, but about sort of the kind of hyper-nationalism, that would shape the kind of really hungry calls for war against Spain. Here we have Roosevelt before he becomes vice president and eventually president. And this is a speech that's often quoted also because it's really Roosevelt is fascinating for his sort of politics masculinity, probably above and beyond what, if you've covered in your class, great. If not, don't worry about it now. But this speech is sort of one of those key texts in American political history. The Philippines offer a grave problem. Many of their people are utterly unfit for self-government and shows no signs of becoming fit. Goes on to sort of, so again, the racial ideology at work there. I have scant patience for those who fear to undertake the task of governing the Philippines, who openly avow that they do fear to undertake it or that they shrink from it because of the expense and trouble. But I have even scanter patience, I have even less patience, that is, with those who make a pretense of humanitarianism to hide and cover their timidity, who cant about liberty and the consent of the governed in order to unexcuse themselves from their unwillingness to play the part of men. Their doctrines condemn your forefathers and mine for ever having settled the United States. So Roosevelt wants no part of any critique of American foreign policy and those who see American expansion into the Pacific and into ruling the Philippines as imperialism, as is in any way antithetical to American national identity. Here we have William Jennings Bryan, who was the Democratic candidate for president in 1900 and had been both the Democratic and populist candidate 4 years before, excuse me. It's a pretty strong anti-imperialist statement that it is at odds with Americans' sense of themselves as a Republican, as an Republican experimental little r, of a government of the consent based on the government, based on the consent of the governed, which colonialism violates inherently. And do note, we cannot afford to add another race question to the race questions which we already have. So Bryan is both engaging the sort of the fundamental ideas of the American Republic, as well as also the racial realities of 1900 America, in sort of evaluating why, in his view, colonizing the Philippines was a very bad idea. And you're pretty much guaranteed to have one visual image, or one thing that's not a text-based document. This image is a little bit crunched, sorry about that, but they love the cartoons from this period, basically getting the idea that, you know, the American eagle is now stretched so far, its talons, its wings, so really crossing the globe from the Caribbean and Puerto Rico to Panama and the building of the canal to the Philippines on the far side of the Pacific. So getting at just the idea of, and you can really see how this bird is straining to cover all of this territory. Gee, but this is an awful stretch, the caption reads. And oh, I see the time. I didn't even notice the timing, but that this is, you know, clearly a 4th of July issue of the magazine. So there's all sorts of ways that you could get at the themes of national identity and how Americans across the political spectrum viewed overseas expansion as inherently in line with who Americans were, or alternatively, entirely incompatible with that idea. Or if you're going for the complexity, try and sort of find ways to get at, bring in, you know, not only manifest destiny, not only, you know, think about how opposition to imperialism could also be self-serving. You know, if you're worried about American jobs, if you're in the labor movement, you could worry about American jobs. Certainly we did see a whole lot of anti-imperialist statements, say from Samuel Gompers, who framed his opposition to the war in terms of the threat to the labor movement. All right, since it's 6:08 at this point, I'm not going to try and do a whole second DBQ, but we've got a couple of DBQs on the landing page. These are also available through the College Board website. Between now and Friday's exam, or if you're taking the makeup in June, don't hesitate to reach out to me with any questions you have, if I can be of any further assistance along the way. I hope the last 5 weeks have helped you sort of really draw out the major ideas, think more about how to engage the DBQ. And again, it's been good to work with you. Wishing you all the very best for the test, and take care now. Have a great rest of the school year. Wishing you all the best, very safe, and hopefully some fun over the summer as well. All right, take care now.